The blood dripping from Iris Shadowfang's neck felt like liquid fire against her skin, each drop a reminder of what she had just lost. She stood in the center of the pack's gathering circle, surrounded by faces she had known her entire life, faces that now looked upon her with nothing but contempt and cold satisfaction. The brand they had pressed against her shoulder still smoked faintly, the acrid smell of her own burning flesh mixing with the copper tang of blood in the frigid evening air. 7 months. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly swollen with the life growing inside her, and they had done this to her anyway. Let the record show. Her brother Caspian's voice rang out across the gathered wolves, his tone dripping with false righteousness. That Iris Shadowfang has been found guilty of betraying our pack by consorting with rogues. The bastard she carries is not of our blood, not of our territory, and therefore, neither she nor it have any claim to our protection. Lies. The word screamed through Iris's mind even as her lips remained sealed. All of it lies. But who would believe her? Caspian had spent months laying the groundwork for this moment, whispering poison into every ear, turning her closest friends into suspicious strangers. She had watched her support network crumble piece by piece, and she had been too slow, too trusting, too foolish to understand what was happening until it was far too late. Her hand moved instinctively to cradle her belly, to protect the innocent life within her from the hatred radiating from all sides. The baby kicked against her palm, a flutter of movement that should have brought joy, but now only deepened her despair. This child deserved better. This child deserved a mother who could protect them, who could provide for them, who wasn't about to be cast out into the wilderness to die. Brother, please. The words scraped past her cracked lips before she could stop them. You know this isn't true, you know. Silence. Caspian's amber eyes, so like their father's and yet so utterly devoid of their father's warmth, cut through her attempted plea like a blade. You have no right to address this pack. You have no right to speak in our presence. The only reason you still breathe is because some among us are soft enough to grant mercy to breeding females, even treacherous ones. The gathered wolves murmured their agreement, and Iris felt each sound like a physical blow. These were people she had grown up with, people she had hunted beside, celebrated with, mourned alongside. And now they looked at her as if she were something foul they had discovered rotting in the underbrush. How did it come to this? The thought spiraled through her mind, dragging with it a cascade of memories and realizations that had come too late. She had noticed Caspian's late-night meetings, his new friends from outside the territory, the way he had suddenly become so interested in pack politics after years of apparent disinterest. She had mentioned her concerns to Dorian, her mate, trusting that he would listen, that he would help her understand. But Dorian had reported everything to Caspian, every suspicion, every worry, every half-formed theory that might have exposed her brother's treasonous dealings with the Blood Moon rogues. And Caspian, ever the tactician, had decided that the easiest way to neutralize the threat she posed was to destroy her credibility entirely, and her life along with it. I believe. Dorian's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, and she looked up to find her mate, stepping forward from the crowd. That I should be the one to finalize this matter. Hope flickered in Iris's chest despite everything. Perhaps Dorian had realized his mistake. Perhaps he had finally seen through Caspian's manipulations. Perhaps the bond they shared, the sacred connection between mates, would compel him to speak the truth, to defend her, to... I, Dorian Greymane, reject Iris Shadowfang as my mate. The words struck her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. The bond between them, already strained by months of his coldness and neglect, began to shred like paper in a storm. Pain lanced through her chest, so sharp and so sudden that she doubled over, her hands pressed against her breastbone, as if she could physically hold herself together. No, 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 no. The denial repeated itself in her mind, a desperate mantra that did nothing to stop the agony ripping through her. She could feel the bond dissolving, feel herself being cut away from the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally, protect her absolutely, cherish her eternally. Throughout our mating, Dorian continued, his voice steady and utterly without remorse, I have provided for this female despite her constant, pathetic demands. Rare venison in the dead of winter, honeyed bread when our stores were low, exotic fruits that had to be traded from distant territories. Her cravings were endless, her gratitude non-existent, and her loyalty clearly belonged to whoever fathered the rogue spawn in her belly. I asked for food for our baby. The thought burned through Iris's pain-hazed mind. I asked my mate to help feed our child, and he acted as if I were asking for the moon. She remembered begging him for a simple meal of venison, remembered the way he had looked at her with such contempt when she had admitted she was hungry again, remembered him snarling that her cravings were pathetic and that she should learn to control herself. She hadn't known then that the pack's food stores had been sabotaged by Caspian's allies, that the shortages were manufactured to create discontent, that her desperate hunger was being used as evidence of her supposed greed and unworthiness. She had simply been a pregnant female trying to nourish the life growing inside her, and they had turned even that into a weapon against her. The bond is broken, Dorian declared, and Iris felt the final thread snap, leaving her hollow and aching in a way she had never imagined possible. This female is nothing to me. She is nothing to this pack. She is nothing. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Iris remained bent over, gasping for breath, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the bond rejection. Her wolf, already weakened by months of stress and deprivation, whimpered deep within her consciousness, confused and wounded and struggling to understand how their mate could have done this to them. Because he was never truly ours? Iris realized with devastating clarity. He was always Caspian's creature, playing a role to keep me docile and unsuspecting. The mating had been arranged by Caspian himself, presented as a gift to his beloved sister, a match that would solidify her place in the pack. But it had been a cage disguised as a blessing, a way to keep her close and controllable while Caspian laid his plans. Get up. A rough hand grabbed her arm and hauled her upright. Through tear-blurred vision, Iris found herself face to face with Caspian, his handsome features twisted with barely concealed satisfaction. Up close, she could see the thin sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his jaw. Signs of tension that the rest of the pack would interpret as righteous anger, but that Iris now recognized as something else entirely. He's afraid. The realization cut through her pain like a shaft of unexpected light. Even now, even with all of this, he's afraid of what I might say, what I might reveal. Because Iris knew things. Fragments of conversations overheard, documents glimpsed on her brother's desk, patterns that had seemed meaningless until they suddenly, horrifyingly, weren't. She knew that Caspian had been meeting with Blood Moon envoys. She knew that there were plans being laid that had nothing to do with pack prosperity and everything to do with power. Power that Caspian intended to claim, no matter who had to die to give it to him. You should thank me, sister. Caspian's voice was pitched low, for her ears alone. I could have had you killed outright. I could have claimed you attacked me and had you executed on the spot. Instead, I'm giving you a chance. Slim, I'll admit, but a chance, nonetheless. His grip tightened painfully on her arm. The Shadowmere Forest lies to the east. That's where you'll go. And if you're very, very lucky, the beasts within will kill you quickly. The Shadowmere Forest. Even in her current state of shock and agony, Iris felt a fresh spike of fear at the name. Everyone knew of the Shadowmere, a vast, ancient woodland that had belonged to the Alpha King's territory for centuries. It was forbidden ground, Deadly ground, a place where trespassers were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. The Alpha King. Sebastian Duskwalker was said to be more monster than man, a creature of such power and ferocity that even the rogues who feared nothing else gave his territory a wide berth. Caspian was sending her to die. Whether by exposure, starvation, or the Alpha King's claws, she was meant to disappear into that forest and never emerge. And with her would go any chance of the truth being revealed, any hope of justice for the crimes Caspian had committed and planned to commit. Our parents. The thought surfaced unbidden, bringing with it a grief so profound it nearly drove Iris back to her knees. Their mother had died 5 years ago, a sudden fever that the healers said came from nowhere and burned through her in 3 days. Their father had never believed it. He had grown obsessed with the truth, and the journal Iris later found hidden in his study had been filled with his growing certainty. The meetings Caspian held with strangers, the whispered conversations that fell silent whenever others approached, the herbs that had gone missing from the healer's stores in the weeks before his wife's illness. 2 years after their mother's death, their father had died too, killed during a hunt, alone in the forest, his throat torn as if by rogues. The pack ruled it a tragic accident. The final journal entry, written the night before that fatal hunt, had been a single damning line: "I must confront Caspian tomorrow. Whatever the cost, I cannot allow this to continue." There had been no confrontation, only another death, ruled accidental, with Caspian inheriting the pack, and Iris too shattered by her second loss in 2 years to question the convenient timing. She had hidden the journal beneath the old oak in the eastern garden, her mother's favorite spot, a place Caspian had never cared about, uncertain what to do with the terrible suspicions it raised. That hesitation had cost her everything. Caspian must have realized she had found it, or at least feared that she might have, and decided to eliminate the threat once and for all. "Move." One of Caspian's guards shoved her forward, and Iris stumbled, barely catching herself before she fell. Around her, the pack parted like water before a stone, leaving a clear path toward the eastern edge of the territory, toward the Shadowmere forest, toward her death. She walked because there was nothing else to do. Her legs moved mechanically, carrying her away from everything she had ever known, while her mind struggled to process the enormity of what had happened. Cast out, rejected, branded a traitor and a whore. The life she had lived, the identity she had built, the future she had imagined, all of it torn away in a matter of minutes, leaving nothing but pain and fear and the small, persistent flutter of movement in her womb. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if demanding her attention. Iris's hand returned to her belly, her fingers spreading protectively over the swell. "I will not let them win." The thought crystallized in her mind with sudden, fierce clarity. "I will survive this. For you, little one. I will survive. And I will find a way to make things right." She didn't know how. She didn't know where she would go or what she would do, but the life growing inside her deserved a chance, and Iris would walk through fire itself to give it one. The tree line loomed ahead, ancient oaks and twisted pines rising like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. The Shadowmere forest, vast and forbidding, waited to receive her. Behind her, she could hear the murmurs of the pack, the satisfied whispers of those who believed they had witnessed justice, and the nervous shuffling of those who weren't entirely comfortable with what had been done. None of them called out to her. None of them tried to stop her. None of them offered even a word of farewell. Iris crossed the boundary of her former territory and stepped into the shadows of the Shadowmere forest without looking back. The cold hit her immediately, seeping through her thin clothing and settling into her bones. Late autumn had stripped most of the trees of their leaves, but the evergreens grew thick here, blocking what little light remained in the fading day. The ground beneath her bare feet. They had taken her shoes before casting her out. One final petty cruelty was covered in a carpet of dead leaves and pine needles that crackled with frost. She walked until she couldn't hear the pack anymore. Then she walked further, driven by some instinct she didn't fully understand, some desperate need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the life that had been stolen from her. The wound on her neck continued to bleed sluggishly, leaving a trail of red drops on the frozen ground. The brand on her shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of her new status. Packless, mateless, nothing. No, she corrected herself, her jaw tightening with sudden resolve. Not nothing. A mother. I am a mother, and I will not stop fighting until my last breath. But determination alone couldn't keep the cold at bay, couldn't fill her empty stomach, couldn't heal the wounds on her body or the deeper wounds on her soul. As the light continued to fade and the temperature continued to drop, Iris felt her strength beginning to fail. Her steps grew slower, more uncertain. Her vision began to blur at the edges. She had no idea how far she had traveled when she heard the sound of water. A stream, somewhere nearby, its gentle burbling a stark contrast to the silence of the forest. Water meant life. Water meant a chance, however slim, of survival. Iris stumbled toward the sound, her feet numb and clumsy, her body running on reserves she didn't know she possessed. The trees parted to reveal a small clearing, and at its center, a crystal-clear stream that caught the last rays of dying sunlight and turned them to liquid gold. She collapsed at the water's edge, her knees hitting the frozen ground with an impact she barely felt. Her reflection stared up at her from the stream's surface. Gaunt features, matted hair, eyes that had gone hollow with shock and exhaustion. She looked like a ghost. She felt like one. Just a moment, she told herself, her eyelids growing impossibly heavy. Just a moment to rest, and then I'll figure out what to do next. She didn't feel herself tip forward, didn't feel the cold water splash against her face, didn't feel anything at all as darkness claimed her and the world faded away. The last thing she was aware of in that space between consciousness and oblivion was the baby kicking one final time, a tiny warrior, fighting even now, refusing to give up. I'm sorry, Iris thought. And then there was nothing. She didn't see the massive wolf that emerged from the shadows on the opposite bank of the stream. Didn't see the way he froze mid-step, his golden eyes fixed on her crumpled form with an intensity that bordered on violent. Didn't hear the low, rumbling growl that built in his chest as he scented blood and fear, and something else. Something that made his entire body go rigid with shock. She didn't feel the strong hands that lifted her from the water's edge, cradling her against a broad chest that radiated heat like a furnace. Didn't hear the rough voice that spoke a single word, half question and half prayer. Mine. Consciousness returned in fragments, like shards of a shattered mirror slowly piecing themselves back together. First came warmth, impossible, blessed warmth that seeped into her frozen limbs and wrapped around her like a cocoon. Then came softness beneath her body, a stark contrast to the frozen ground and icy water that had claimed her last coherent moments. And finally, threading through it all like a golden ribbon of sensation she couldn't identify, came something else entirely. A pull, a tug somewhere deep in her chest, as if an invisible thread had been anchored behind her breastbone and was now drawing taut, urging her toward something, or someone, just beyond her awareness. Iris's wolf, dormant for so long beneath the weight of rejection and exhaustion, stirred with a sudden ferocity that made her gasp. Her eyes flew open. The face above her was carved from shadows and firelight, all sharp angles and barely contained intensity. Dark hair fell across a broad forehead, framing eyes that seemed to shift between amber and molten gold as she watched. A strong jaw, stubbled with several days' growth. lips that might have been carved from stone, pressed into a hard line that softened almost imperceptibly as their gazes met. And then everything shifted. Heat flooded through Iris's body like wildfire racing across dry grassland, burning away the cold that had settled into her very bones. Her skin prickled with awareness, every nerve ending suddenly alive and straining toward the stranger who knelt beside her. The pull in her chest intensified until it was nearly painful, a desperate yearning that made no sense, that shouldn't have been possible. That mate. The word howled through her consciousness with such force that Iris's body jerked involuntarily. Her wolf, silent and wounded for so long, was suddenly surging forward with a strength she hadn't felt in months, straining against the boundaries of her human form as if trying to leap out and claim this stranger for their own. Mate, mate, mate. No, Iris breathed, the word barely audible even to her own ears. That's not. I can't. But her hand was already moving, reaching toward the broad chest that hovered above her, fingers stretching of their own accord toward the heat she could feel radiating from his body. She caught herself at the last moment, her hand freezing midair between them, trembling with the effort of holding back. The man's eyes, her mate's eyes, her wolf insisted, flashed brilliant gold, the color of morning sunlight on autumn leaves. A sound rumbled from his chest, low and primal and possessive in a way that sent shivers racing down Iris's spine. It took her a moment to recognize it as a growl, but not a threatening one. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of a wolf recognizing his other half, of an alpha scenting what belonged to him. "You're awake." His voice was rough as gravel, as if he hadn't spoken in days, and it scraped across Iris's heightened senses like velvet against bare skin. "I wasn't sure you would—" He cut himself off, his jaw clenching, and Iris watched the muscles in his throat work as he swallowed. "Who hurt what is mine?" The question came out barely human, more snarl than speech, and Iris flinched despite herself. The movement seemed to pain him. She saw it in the slight widening of his eyes, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, as if to prevent himself from reaching for her. "I don't understand," she whispered, and hated how small her voice sounded, how broken. "I was mated. I was rejected. This shouldn't be. You can't be." And yet, he reached toward her face, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she couldn't, her body frozen by the impossibility of what was happening, his fingertips brushed against her cheek with a gentleness that stole her breath. Electricity sparked where their skin touched, racing through her veins like lightning, and Iris heard herself make a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The man's golden eyes darkened with an emotion she couldn't name. "I am Sebastian Duskwalker," he said, his voice still carrying that rough edge that made her wolf want to roll over and bare her throat in submission. "Alpha King of these lands, and you, little wolf, are my fated mate." Sebastian Duskwalker. The name echoed through Iris's mind, bringing with it all the stories she had heard throughout her life. The Alpha King who ruled the Shadowmere with an iron fist, the monster who showed no mercy to those who trespassed on his territory. The beast who was said to tear out the throats of his enemies and feast on their still warm hearts. She should be terrified. She was terrified, but not of him. The fear that clawed at her chest had nothing to do with the dangerous predator kneeling beside her, and everything to do with the impossible sensation flooding through her body. She had been mated once, bonded to Dorian in a ceremony she had thought sacred, only to have that bond shattered and used as a weapon against her. The pain of rejection still echoed in her chest, a raw wound that hadn't begun to heal. And now this. Now a new bond trying to form, stronger than anything she had felt before, demanding that she trust again, that she open herself to another alpha who could destroy her just as thoroughly as the last one had. "This isn't possible," she said again, but even she could hear how weak the protest sounded. Fated mates are stories. They don't. You feel it. It wasn't a question. Sebastian's hand had moved from her cheek to her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her bone with that same devastating gentleness. Tell me you don't feel it, and I will walk away. I will leave you in peace. Arrange for your transport to whatever territory you wish. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and Iris felt herself drowning in their depths. But you cannot tell me that, can you? Because you feel what I feel. You know what I know. Her wolf was howling now, pressing against her consciousness with desperate intensity. Claim him. Let him claim us. Ours, ours, ours. Iris's hand, still suspended between them, trembled. Then, as if moving through honey, she let it fall the final few inches until her palm pressed flat against Sebastian's chest. The world exploded. Heat. Belonging. A sense of rightness so profound it brought tears streaming down her cheeks. Through her palm, she could feel his heart pounding. Rapid and strong, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. The invisible thread in her chest pulled taut and then settled, clicking into place like a key finding its lock. Sebastian's growl deepened into something that sounded almost like a purr. His free hand came up to cover hers where it lay against his heart, pressing her palm more firmly against his warmth. There, he breathed, and his voice had lost some of its roughness, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to wonder. There you are. I've been waiting for you. The absurdity of it all crashed over Iris like a wave. Hours ago, she had been cast out by her pack, branded a traitor, left to die in the wilderness. She was 7 months pregnant with another man's child, wounded and starving and broken in more ways than she could count. And now the most powerful alpha on the continent was kneeling beside her, touching her as if she were something precious, looking at her as if she were the answer to every question he had ever asked. I'm nobody, she said, and her voice cracked on the words. I'm less than nobody. I'm mine. The word cut through her protest like a blade through silk. Sebastian's eyes flashed gold again, and this time Iris saw his canines lengthen slightly, the beast beneath his skin pressing forward to make its claim known. You are mine, and I am yours, and whoever taught you to speak of yourself that way will answer for it. His gaze dropped to her neck, to the wound that still seeped blood sluggishly, and something terrible shifted in his expression. The gentleness didn't disappear. It was still there, carefully banked, directed entirely at her, but layered over it was a rage so cold and so complete that Iris felt her breath catch. They burned your packmark from you, Sebastian said, and each word was measured, precise, controlled in a way that somehow made it more frightening than if he had been shouting. They cast you out, bleeding, carrying a pup. His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind together. Tell me who did this. Tell me, and I will bring you their hearts on a silver platter. The offer was genuine. Iris could hear it in his voice, see it in the deadly stillness of his body. This man, this alpha, this king, would wage war for her, would destroy the pack that had destroyed her, burn them all to ash and build something new from the ruins. And despite everything, despite the betrayal that still burned in her chest and the hunger for justice that had kept her walking even when her body wanted to give up, Iris found herself shaking her head. Not yet, she whispered. There are things you need to know first. Things I need to. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she felt Sebastian's arms tighten around her, supporting her weight with effortless strength. The baby. Is the baby? Your pup is strong. Sebastian's voice softened as his hand moved to rest against her swollen belly, and Iris felt the baby kick in response, as if recognizing a protector. I could hear the heartbeat even before I reached the stream, fast and fierce, like their mother. Their mother. The words wrapped around Iris's heart and squeezed. She had spent the last 3 months being told that the child she carried was a burden, a bastard, a stain on the pack's honor. Dorian had refused to acknowledge the pregnancy as his, had sneered at every sign of her growing belly, had told her that he would never claim the rogue's spawn she was carrying. But Sebastian looked at her rounded stomach as if he were seeing a miracle. His hand rested against her belly with a reverence that made her throat tight, his thumb tracing gentle circles over the stretched fabric of her ruined dress. "This pup will never want for anything," he said quietly, and the vow in his voice was ironclad. "Neither will you. Whatever you need, whatever you desire, you will have it. I swear this to you on my blood and my throne." Iris wanted to believe him. Goddess help her. She wanted to believe him with every fiber of her being. But she had trusted before. She had loved before. And she had learned that promises could be poison wrapped in pretty words. "You don't know me," she said, and was proud that her voice emerged steady. "You don't know what they accused me of, what they said I did. I could be— You could be a mass murderer and a traitor to 12 kingdoms," Sebastian interrupted calmly, "and you would still be my mate. There is no accusation that could change what the bond tells me is true." His golden eyes held hers, and she saw nothing but absolute certainty in their depths. "But since we are speaking of accusations, perhaps you should tell me what they said. I find myself very interested in the lies your former pack believed about you." Iris stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was another trap like all the others. She found nothing but patience and quiet rage, the patience directed at her, the rage directed at everyone who had hurt her. "My brother," she finally said, and watched Sebastian's expression sharpen at the word. "Caspian Shadowfang, he—" But before she could continue, her stomach cramped violently, and she doubled over with a gasp. Not pain. Hunger. The kind of hunger that had gnawed at her for months, the kind that pregnancy had transformed into something desperate and all-consuming. "When did you last eat?" Sebastian's voice had gone sharp, focused. Iris tried to remember. "Yesterday? Maybe the day before. They stopped giving me full rations after—" She broke off, embarrassed by the admission, embarrassed by how weak she must seem. But Sebastian wasn't looking at her with disappointment or disgust. He was looking at her with that same cold, terrible rage, his golden eyes promising violence to whoever had denied his mate sustenance. "Sleep," he said, and though it wasn't an order, it carried the weight of one. "I will bring you food, real food, and when you wake, you will tell me everything." He lifted her then, as easily as if she weighed nothing at all, and Iris was too exhausted to protest. Her head fell against his chest, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her cheek. Strong, constant, safe. She was asleep before he had taken 3 steps. Iris dreamed of fire and blood, and her brother's laugh echoing through endless darkness. She dreamed of Dorian's cold eyes as he spoke the words of rejection, of her parents' faces as they faded into memory, of running and never being able to escape the shadows that pursued her. But woven through the nightmares was something new, a thread of gold, warm and bright, that wrapped around her consciousness and held the darkness at bay. A presence that felt like shelter, like protection, like home. She woke slowly, reluctantly, the way one surfaces from a deep pool. The warmth was still there, the impossible, blessed warmth that had greeted her return to consciousness before, and now it carried a scent. Pine and wood smoke and something darker, muskier, that made her wolf sit up and take notice. "Smoked trout," she murmured, still half asleep, chasing the edges of a craving that had haunted her for weeks. "With juniper berries. Is that—" She opened her eyes. Sebastian Duskwalker, the Alpha King, The monster of the Shadowmere was kneeling beside her bed with a steaming plate balanced carefully in his massive hands. The dish he held was exactly what she had described: delicate pink fish, expertly smoked, garnished with deep purple juniper berries and sprigs of fresh rosemary. Iris stared at him, then at the plate, then back at him. "You talked in your sleep," Sebastian said, and was that embarrassment flickering across his harsh features? "This craving, the trout with juniper. I heard you mention it. Several times." He cleared his throat. "I hope it's adequate. I haven't prepared this particular dish before, but the palace kitchens had what I needed." "You—" Iris's voice caught. She had to swallow hard before she could continue. "You made this? Yourself? My mate and pup will never want for anything." The words were simple, stated as fact rather than boast, and they dismantled Iris's defenses as if they had never existed. "If you desire smoked trout with juniper berries at dawn, then smoked trout with juniper berries at dawn you shall have." Iris felt tears prick at her eyes again, and this time she didn't try to stop them from falling. She remembered begging Dorian for something, anything, to quiet the desperate hunger that pregnancy had awakened in her. She remembered his sneer, his contempt, his declaration that her cravings were pathetic. And now, here was Sebastian, the Alpha King himself, having apparently spent the pre-dawn hours hunting and preparing a specific dish because she had mentioned it while sleeping. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt completely inadequate for the emotion swelling in her chest. Sebastian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Eat," he said, pressing the plate into her hands. "You need your strength, and the pup needs nourishment. We can talk after you've eaten your fill." Iris obeyed, too hungry to argue even if she had wanted to. The fish was perfect, smoky and delicate, the juniper adding a subtle bitterness that balanced the richness of the meat. She ate every bite, barely pausing to breathe, and when the plate was empty, Sebastian simply disappeared and returned with another. Fresh bread drizzled with honey, sliced apples, a small pot of berry preserves. "Honeyed bread," Iris said softly, recognizing another craving she had learned to suppress. "You—" "Rest," Sebastian said firmly. "Eat. Everything else can wait." So Iris ate, and ate, and ate. For the first time in months, she consumed a full meal without watching the door for someone to take it away, without rationing each bite to make it last, without feeling guilty for needing sustenance. Sebastian stayed beside her throughout, never rushing her, never commenting on how quickly the food disappeared. When she finally sat back, her stomach pleasantly full for the first time she could remember, Iris found herself studying the man who had changed everything in a matter of hours. In the morning light filtering through silk curtains, she could see him more clearly than she had the night before. He was massive, easily the largest alpha she had ever encountered, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of combat and survival. His dark hair was pulled back from his face now, revealing the sharp planes of his cheekbones and the strong line of his jaw. And his eyes, still that shifting amber gold, watched her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. "You have questions," Sebastian said. It wasn't a question. Iris nodded slowly. "Many, starting with why." "Why what? Why any of this?" She gestured vaguely at the room around her, at the sumptuous bed she lay in, at the remnants of the meal he had prepared with his own hands. "I showed up in your territory uninvited, pregnant with another man's child, branded as a traitor. By all rights, you should have killed me, or at least," she swallowed hard, "at least thrown me in a cell until you could determine whether I posed a threat." Sebastian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Do you know how old I am, Iris Shadowfang?" The use of her full name sent a shiver through her. "No." 237 years. He held up a hand when her eyes widened. The Duskwalker bloodline carries certain advantages, longevity being one of them. I have ruled the Shadowmere for nearly 2 centuries. I have fought wars, ended wars, built alliances, and destroyed enemies. His golden eyes found hers. And in all that time, I never once felt the mate bond. I began to believe I was one of those unfortunates who simply didn't have a fated mate, that I would rule alone forever. Iris's heart clenched at the quiet pain beneath his words. And then, Sebastian continued softly, I was patrolling my eastern border, something I almost never do myself anymore, and I caught a scent on the wind. Blood and fear and something underneath them both that called to me like nothing ever has. I followed that scent to a stream and found a pregnant female collapsed in the water, more dead than alive. His voice roughened, and everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life, about what was possible, all of it shattered in an instant. He reached out and took her hand, cradling it gently in his much larger one. You asked me why, Iris. The answer is simple. You are my mate. My fated mate. The one person in this world who was made for me as I was made for them. There is nothing you could do, nothing you could be, that would make me turn you away. The child you carry is not mine by blood, but they are yours, and therefore, they are mine. His grip tightened fractionally. I have waited 2 centuries for you. I will spend the next 2 centuries, and however many more we are granted, proving that your trust is not misplaced. Iris stared at him, overwhelmed. She wanted to believe him. Goddess, how she wanted to believe him. But the wounds were still so fresh, the memories of betrayal so sharp. I don't know if I can, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Trust you, I mean. Trust anyone. The last time I trusted... She broke off, her throat closing around the words. Sebastian nodded slowly, and she saw no offense in his expression, only understanding. I know. And I am not asking for your trust today, or tomorrow, or even next month. I am simply asking for the chance to earn it. Can you give me that? Iris thought about it, really thought about it, examining her shattered heart and the fragile hope that had begun to take root there despite everything. Yes, she finally said. I can give you that. Sebastian's smile was small but genuine, transforming his harsh features into something almost soft. Then that is enough. For now. The news of the Alpha King's fated mate spread through the Shadowmere territory like wildfire. By midday, it seemed every wolf in the kingdom knew that Sebastian Duskwalker had carried a pregnant, wounded female from the eastern border and installed her in the royal quarters. And by evening, the whispers had begun. Iris heard them even from her chambers, her enhanced hearing picking up snippets of conversation that she would rather have ignored. Used goods, I heard. Another Alpha's reject. Pregnant with some rogue's bastard, and he expects us to accept her as... Pathetic, really. The king has waited all this time, and this is what fate gives him. She tried to ignore them. She tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, on the softness of the bed, on the full sensation in her stomach that reminded her Sebastian's care was real, even if she couldn't quite believe in it yet. But the words cut deep, finding the wounds that her former pack had left and tearing them open again. Used goods. Reject. Pathetic. Hadn't Dorian used those same words when he... The door to her chambers burst open, and Iris flinched before recognizing Sebastian's form silhouetted in the doorway. But something was different about him now. His eyes blazed gold, his jaw was set in a hard line, and rage radiated from every line of his body. Come with me, he said, and his voice vibrated with barely restrained fury. Iris rose on shaky legs, uncertain what was happening but unable to refuse. Sebastian offered her his arm, a gesture of respect that surprised her, and led her from the chambers into the corridor beyond. The palace was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and polished marble, but Iris barely noticed her surroundings. She was too focused on the tension thrumming through Sebastian's body, on the way other wolves pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, eyes downcast in submission. They reached what could only be the throne room, a vast chamber dominated by a massive seat carved from black stone, its back rising toward the vaulted ceiling like the spine of some great beast. And before it, arranged in nervous clusters, stood what must have been the entire court. Sebastian led Iris to the foot of the dais. Then he released her arm, climbed the steps, and turned to face his gathered subjects. "I have heard," he said, and his voice echoed through the sudden silence like thunder, "that some among you have concerns about my mate." No one moved, no one breathed. I have heard whispers in my own halls, speculation about her past, judgments about her worth. Sebastian's golden eyes swept the crowd, and Iris saw several wolves flinch as his gaze passed over them. "So, let me make something absolutely clear, in terms that even the most foolish among you cannot misunderstand." He descended 2 steps, 3, until he stood directly in front of Iris. Then, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the fury in his voice, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. "This female is my fated mate," Sebastian said, loud enough for every wolf in the room to hear. "She is not a human woman to be judged by human standards of virtue. She is a wolf, and among wolves, the fated bond is sacred beyond all other considerations." He turned to face the crowd, positioning himself slightly in front of Iris in what she recognized instinctively as a protective stance. "Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me, and I think you all know what happens to those who disrespect me." Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. "Furthermore," Sebastian continued, his voice dropping to something that was almost a purr, but somehow more threatening for its softness, "I am hereby elevating Iris Shadowfang to her rightful position. She will sit beside my throne. She will participate in all matters of state. She will receive every courtesy and privilege that her station demands." A rustle went through the crowd. Shock, perhaps, or fear. "Does anyone," Sebastian said, and now his voice was pure ice, "wish to discuss my Luna's worth?" The silence stretched for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. "No, Your Majesty," came a ragged chorus of voices. "Good." Sebastian's hand found Iris's again, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Then you may consider this court dismissed. I suggest you all use the remainder of the evening to reconsider any misguided opinions you may have harbored." The wolves practically fled the throne room, and within moments, Iris and Sebastian stood alone in the vast chamber. The rage was draining from his features now, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "I hope that wasn't too—" he began. Iris cut him off by squeezing his hand. Hard. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words came out thick with emotion. "No one has ever, Dorian never." She shook her head, unable to finish. Sebastian turned to face her fully, his expression softening. "You are my mate, Iris. My Luna. Defending your honor is not a burden I bear. It is a privilege I cherish." His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You are not used goods. You are not pathetic. You are the other half of my soul, and I will remind you of that every day until you believe it." Iris stared up at him, this terrifying, powerful, inexplicably gentle alpha, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the mate bond, though that was there too, warm and bright and growing stronger. This was something else. This was the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart, the first tentative reaching toward trust. "I'm starting to believe," She admitted quietly. I think, I think I'm starting to believe. Sebastian's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. That, he said, is all I ask. The days that followed Sebastian's declaration in the throne room passed in a haze of warmth and growing wonder. Iris found herself settling into the rhythm of the Duskwalker Palace, learning its corridors and courtyards, discovering which servants would meet her eyes with genuine kindness and which still harbored reservations they were now too frightened to voice. But more than the palace, more than the careful politics of the court, she found herself learning Sebastian. He was not what she had expected. The fearsome Alpha King, the monster of her childhood nightmares, the wolf whose very name had been used to frighten pups into obedience. He brought her tea in the mornings. He asked about her sleep, her comfort, the baby's movements. He listened when she spoke and remembered everything she said, filing away her preferences and dislikes like precious treasures to be hoarded. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in bands of crimson, Sebastian took her to a quiet terrace overlooking the eastern mountains. I need you to learn something, he said, his expression unusually serious. An emergency frequency, a howl pitched to cut through stone and distance. If you ever use it, I will hear you through the bond, no matter where I am in the palace. He taught her the sound, making her practice until she could produce it cleanly. I pray you never need it, he said, but I will not leave my mate unprotected. There were also the strange new sensations that came with the strengthening bond, a tingling in her palms when Sebastian was near, a warmth that sometimes flared so intense it felt like light was trying to push through her skin. When she mentioned it to him, his eyes had widened. The old texts speak of this, he said slowly. In the earliest mate bonds, the strongest ones, the connection could manifest as physical energy, a force of sorts, when the bond was under threat. He studied her hands with something like awe. I have never heard of it happening in my lifetime. But then, I have never had a mate like you. On the fourth morning after the throne room confrontation, Iris woke to an unusual commotion beyond her chamber doors. Voices carried through the heavy oak, Sebastian's low rumble and another voice she didn't recognize, sharp with barely concealed hostility. She rose carefully, one hand supporting her heavy belly, and reached for the robe of deep burgundy velvet that had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation. When she opened her door, the conversation in the corridor cut off abruptly. Sebastian stood with his back partially turned to her, his massive frame blocking most of her view, but she could see past his shoulder to the wolves who had arrived in the night. 3 of them. 2 were clearly guards, their postures rigid with military discipline. But the third, Iris's blood turned to ice in her veins. Caspian Shadowfang stood in the corridor of the Duskwalker Palace, wearing the formal attire of a diplomatic envoy, his smile as sharp and false as broken glass. Sister, he said, and the word dripped with mockery. How delightful to see you've landed on your feet. Or should I say, on your back? Sebastian's growl was immediate and thunderous, vibrating through the stone walls. You will address my mate with respect, envoy, or you will leave this palace in pieces. Caspian raised his hands in mock surrender, his amber eyes dancing with barely concealed amusement. My apologies, Your Majesty. Old habits, you understand. Iris and I have a complicated family history. So I've gathered. Sebastian's voice was cold enough to freeze fire. Your Pax Council sent word of your arrival, though they failed to mention you were related to my Luna. An oversight, I'm sure. Caspian's gaze slid past Sebastian to find Iris, and she fought not to flinch under the weight of his attention. I'm here to discuss the territorial disputes along our shared border. The rogue attacks have increased significantly, and the Shadowfang Pack believes a formal alliance with the Duskwalker throne would benefit us all. Iris's wolf stirred with warning, hackles rising even in her human form. Caspian didn't care about alliances. Caspian didn't care about anything except power and the accumulation of it. If he was here, it was because he wanted something. And whatever that something was, it would cost someone dearly. "We can discuss the terms of any potential alliance in the council chamber," Sebastian said, his tone making it clear this was a dismissal. "Lord Ashworth will show you to your quarters." "Of course." Caspian bowed, low and mocking. "I look forward to becoming better acquainted with your court, Your Majesty. And with your lovely mate, of course. We have so much to catch up on." He swept away down the corridor, his guards following in lockstep, and Iris didn't realize she was shaking until Sebastian's arms came around her from behind, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. "You know him," Sebastian said. It wasn't a question. "He's my brother." The words tasted like ash. "Half-brother. He's the one who accused me, who had me cast out." Sebastian went very still. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely human. "The one who called your baby a rogue's bastard?" Iris nodded, unable to trust her voice. "The one who burned away your packmark?" Another nod. She could feel Sebastian's heartbeat against her back, could feel it accelerating with fury barely held in check. "I cannot kill a diplomatic envoy without cause," Sebastian said, and each word sounded like it was being torn from him against his will. "But I want you to know, Iris. I want to. I want to tear him apart for what he did to you, for every moment of suffering he caused you and our pup." "Our pup." The casual claim sent warmth flooding through her chest even as fear still clenched her stomach. "He's dangerous," Iris whispered. "More dangerous than he seems. Caspian doesn't do anything without a reason, and if he's here, it's because he wants something. Something he's willing to risk your anger to get." Sebastian turned her gently in his arms, tilting her chin up until she met his eyes. The gold was bright with protective rage, but beneath it was something softer. Concern, care, the steady warmth of the bond that pulsed between them. "He will not touch you," Sebastian said. "He will not touch our child. I swear it on my life, on my crown, on every drop of blood in my body. Whatever game he's playing, he will lose." Iris wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the power of the Alpha King was enough to protect her from the machinations of her brother's brilliant, twisted mind. But she had lived under Caspian's roof for 19 years. She had watched him manipulate, scheme, and destroy anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. "Just be careful," she said. "He's not just cruel, he's clever. And he never shows his hand until he's already won." Over the following week, Caspian wove himself into the fabric of Sebastian's court like a spider spinning silk. He was charming with the nobles, respectful with the servants, deferential to Sebastian in every public interaction. He brought gifts, rare wines, exquisite jewelry, books of ancient wolf lore that made even the court scholars murmur with appreciation. And everywhere Iris went, she felt his eyes following her. Sebastian kept her close, but he couldn't be at her side every moment. The demands of ruling a kingdom didn't pause for personal concerns, and there were meetings Iris couldn't attend, decisions that required his attention in chambers where she wasn't yet welcome. During those times, she found herself jumping at shadows, her wolf constantly on alert, her hand moving unconsciously to shield her belly. The baby was moving more now, strong kicks and rolls that sometimes made her gasp. She had started to think of the child as a daughter, though she had no way of knowing for certain. A fierce little girl with her father's golden eyes, not Dorian's pale blue, never his. The thought of that connection severed, bringing her nothing but relief. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she wondered. Caspian's accusation had been a lie, but it had played on a fear that had lived in her heart since the night she'd given herself to Dorian. He had been cold even then, perfunctory, interested in establishing his claim rather than bringing her pleasure. She had convinced herself it was normal, that first times were always awkward, that things would improve. They never had. And now, carrying a child conceived in such loveless union, she found herself praying that some spark of her own spirit lived in this little one. That the baby would inherit her stubbornness, her resilience, her ability to survive the worst the world could throw at her. Not Dorian's coldness, not Caspian's cruelty, just her own fierce determination to live. It was late afternoon when Iris found herself in the palace gardens, seeking the peace of growing things and open sky. The sun was warm on her face, the scent of roses and honeysuckle filling her lungs, and for a moment she let herself forget the danger lurking within the palace walls. "You look content." She didn't startle at Sebastian's voice. She had felt him approaching through the bond, a warm presence moving closer like a second sun. He settled onto the stone bench beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and for a long moment they simply sat together in comfortable silence. "I was thinking about the baby," Iris admitted, "wondering who she'll be, what she'll become." She. Sebastian's voice held a note of surprise mixed with something softer. "I don't know for certain." Iris's hand moved to her belly, feeling the answering flutter of movement beneath her palm. "But I keep dreaming of a little girl. Dark hair, like mine. Eyes like—" She stopped, uncertain. "Like what?" "I don't know." It was the truth. In her dreams, the baby's eyes shifted. Sometimes pale and cold like Dorian's, sometimes green and bright like her own, and sometimes, increasingly, bright with gold like Sebastian's. As if the child herself was uncertain which father to claim. "I suppose I'll find out when she arrives." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Iris, I want you to know something. Whatever color her eyes are, whatever she looks like when she comes into this world, she is your daughter. And that makes her precious to me." Iris felt tears prick at her eyes. "She's not yours. By blood, I mean. You don't have to—" "She will be mine in every way that matters." Sebastian's hand covered hers on her belly, and the baby kicked against his palm as if in greeting. His sharp intake of breath told her he'd felt it. And when she looked at his face, she saw wonder there. Raw, unguarded wonder. "I will raise her as my own. I will protect her, provide for her, love her, if you'll let me." The tears spilled over now, tracking down her cheeks in hot trails. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you do that? She's another male's child. The evidence of my—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the shame that Dorian and Caspian had made her feel about her own body, her own choices. "She's the evidence of your strength." Sebastian's voice was fierce. "Of your survival. You carried this child through rejection and exile, through starvation and despair. You kept her alive when everything in the world was trying to kill you both. That's not shame, Iris. That's glory." Iris turned into him, burying her face against his shoulder, and Sebastian's arms came around her instantly. He held her while she cried, not the desperate, frightened tears of her exile, but something cleaner, something that felt like release. "I don't deserve you," she whispered against his chest. "You deserve everything," he replied, "and I intend to spend the rest of our lives proving it to you." They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Iris felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The evening feast was a grand affair, as all feasts at the Duskwalker court tended to be. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh breads, fruits and cheeses and sweets of every description. Wine flowed freely, and the great hall echoed with conversation and laughter. Iris sat in her newly established place beside Sebastian's throne, still not entirely comfortable with the weight of so many eyes upon her. But she was learning to hold her head high, to meet gazes directly, to present the image of a Luna worthy of the Alpha King's favor. Caspian sat at a table near the front, surrounded by nobles who seemed charmed by his easy manner and quick wit. Every so often, his eyes would find Iris's across the crowded room, and his smile would sharpen into something that made her blood run cold. "You're not eating." Sebastian's voice was quiet, pitched for her ears alone. When she glanced at him, she found his brow furrowed with concern. "I'm not hungry." It was a lie. Her pregnancy cravings had been fierce lately, but the sight of Caspian had soured her appetite. "Iris." Sebastian's hand found hers beneath the table, his thumb tracing soothing circles over her knuckles. "I know you're frightened. I know he makes you feel unsafe, but I promise you—" The crash came from the far end of the hall. A servant collapsed beside an overturned tray of goblets. Then another, and another, wolves dropping where they stood as screams began to rise. Sebastian was on his feet instantly, pulling Iris behind him as chaos erupted throughout the great hall. Nobles were clutching their throats, their faces turning gray, their eyes rolling back in their heads, as whatever had felled them took hold. "The wine!" someone screamed. "The wine is poisoned." But Iris noticed, with a cold clarity that cut through her terror, that not everyone was affected. Some wolves stood untouched amid the fallen, their goblets clutched in trembling hands, their faces pale with shock, but their bodies whole, including Caspian. "Guards!" Sebastian's roar cut through the chaos. "Seal the doors! No one leaves until we find the source." But Caspian was already moving toward them, his expression a mask of horrified concern. "Your Majesty, thank the moon you're unharmed. When I saw the servants fall, I feared the worst." "The wine," Sebastian said, his voice deadly calm. "You were drinking the wine." "From my own flask, Your Majesty." Caspian produced a silver vessel from his belt, holding it up for inspection. "I have a sensitive stomach. I always carry my own supply when traveling." Convenient. Too convenient. Iris's wolf was snarling, scratching at the inside of her skull with the desperate need to expose the threat that stood before them wearing her brother's face. "Sebastian," she started, but Caspian cut her off. "Your Majesty, I hesitate to speak ill of my own sister, but—" He paused, his expression shifting to something that looked almost like reluctant duty. "You should know that Iris has access to the royal kitchens. She's been seen there multiple times this week, speaking with the servants, handling the supplies." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Iris felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. "That's a lie," she breathed. "I was there because, Sebastian, the Cravings. You know She's always been skilled with herbs and tinctures." Caspian's voice was heavy with false sorrow. "Our mother taught her well, before the accident. Before you murdered her." Iris wanted to scream. "Before you poisoned her tea and watched her choke to death while our father wept, thinking it was a tragic illness when really it was you. It was always you." But she had no proof. She had never had proof. Only the certainty in her gut that the brother who had tormented her since childhood was capable of anything. "I would never hurt these people," Iris said, hating how small her voice sounded, how desperate. "Sebastian, please." "Of course she wouldn't," Sebastian said, and the cold fury in his voice was directed at Caspian, not at her. "My mate would never poison innocents, you conniving snake. But I think you know that, don't you? I think that's exactly why you're trying to cast blame on her." Something flickered in Caspian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that his gambit hadn't worked? But he recovered quickly, his expression settling back into wounded innocence. "I'm only trying to help, Your Majesty. My sister has clearly deceived you, and Get out of my sight." Sebastian's voice had dropped to something barely human, a growl that resonated through the bones of everyone present. Return to your quarters and do not emerge until I send for you. If I find any evidence that you had a hand in this attack, diplomatic immunity will not save you from what comes next." Caspian bowed, his smile never wavering. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'm at your disposal." He walked out of the great hall with the measured stride of a man who had achieved exactly what he intended, and Iris watched him go with a growing certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever game Caspian was playing, he had just shown his first card. And people were dying because of it. Sebastian pulled her close as the healers rushed to tend the fallen, as guards began systematically testing the remaining food and drink for traces of poison. Wolfsbane, they would determine later. Enough to weaken, but not kill. A message, not a massacre. "He's framing me," Iris whispered against Sebastian's chest. "He's going to turn your court against me, and then nothing." Sebastian's arms tightened around her. "I know you, Iris. I know your heart. No manipulation of his will changed that." But Iris heard what he didn't say. What they both knew. Caspian was just getting started. The night that followed the poisoning stretched long and sleepless. Iris sat in the window seat of Sebastian's chambers, watching the moon trace its path across the sky, while her mind churned with terrible certainty. Caspian had made his opening move, and the court was already whispering. She had heard them as Sebastian's guards escorted her back to their rooms, the sidelong glances, the murmured speculation about the pregnant outsider who had somehow found her way into the Alpha King's bed and now stood accused of poisoning his people. Sebastian had been called away to deal with the crisis, to comfort the families of those who had fallen ill, to coordinate the investigation that would hopefully clear her name. But Iris knew her brother. Evidence could be manufactured. Witnesses could be bought. By morning, Caspian would have woven a web of lies so intricate that even Sebastian's faith in her might begin to waver. Her hand drifted to her belly, where the baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. 7 months now. 7 months of carrying this life that Dorian had rejected, that her pack had condemned as worthless. 7 months of running and hiding and slowly learning to believe she might deserve something better. She couldn't run anymore. Not from this. The thought crystallized in her mind with sudden fierce clarity. She had spent her entire life fleeing from Caspian's cruelty, first as a child, then as a young woman, and finally as a pregnant outcast stumbling into the wilderness to die. Every time she ran, he followed. Every time she hid, he found her. The only way this ended was if she stopped retreating and started fighting back. But she had no power. No proof. Nothing but the memories that haunted her dreams and the certainty in her gut that her brother was a monster wearing a diplomat's smile. The memories. Iris straightened slowly, her heart beginning to pound with sudden hope. The journal. Their father's private journal. The one she had found in the secret compartment of his study desk after his death. The same journal she had wrapped in oilcloth and hidden inside the hollowed stone beneath the old oak in the eastern garden. Her mother's spot, a place Caspian had never once visited. Its pages had detailed everything. The missing herbs, the meetings with strangers, the growing certainty that their mother's death had been no fever and that his eldest son was responsible. She had been too grief-stricken to act on what she'd read, and later, too afraid of what Caspian might do if he learned she knew his secrets. But the journal still existed. It had to. Caspian had torn the pack house apart after their father's death, searching for something he never found. She had assumed it was valuable heirlooms or hidden wealth. But now she understood. He had been looking for evidence of his own crimes, evidence their father had been collecting in secret. If she could get a message to someone she trusted in her old pack, if the journal was still hidden where she had last seen it. A sound at the door made her turn, her wolf suddenly alert and snarling. But it wasn't Sebastian who entered. Caspian stood in the doorway, his diplomatic mask firmly in place, his smile the same empty curve it had always been. Behind him, the corridor was suspiciously empty. "Hello, little sister," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." Iris rose from the window seat, her hand instinctively moving to cover her belly. "How did you get past the guards?" "The same way I got Wolfsbane into the wine supply." His smile widened, showing teeth. "Money and patience. It's remarkable what people will do for enough gold, especially when they think they're serving a higher purpose." He moved further into the room, his eyes tracking over her swollen figure with distaste. "Look at you. Pathetic as always. Did you really think you could escape me by spreading your legs for the Alpha King?" "I didn't escape you," Iris said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I walked into a forest to die. You're the one who followed me here." "Because you're a loose end, Iris. You've always been a loose end." He circled toward her, slow and predatory. "Father suspected me. You know, he was getting too close to the truth about Mother's death. About my arrangement with the Blood Moon rogues. I had to act before he could expose me. But you—" His expression flickered with something like frustration. "You were supposed to die quietly. Starve in some corner or let the pregnancy complications take you. Instead, you found yourself a powerful protector and started playing at being a queen." Iris's back hit the window, cold glass pressing through the thin fabric of her nightgown. Caspian was between her and the door now, blocking any chance of escape. Her wolf was howling, scratching at the inside of her skull, but the creature was still weak from months of malnourishment and the strain of pregnancy. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat. "But we can still fix this, Iris. You and I. Tell your Alpha King you've reconsidered, that you want to return to the Shadowfang Pack. I'll withdraw the treason charges, restore your position. You can even keep the brat." His voice turned silky, reasonable, the voice that had fooled their father and the entire pack for years. "All I need is for you to walk away from Sebastian Duskwalker before his obsession with you makes him start asking questions I can't answer." "You want me to give up my fated mate?" Iris said flatly. "So you can continue selling our pack's secrets to the Blood Moon rogues without interference. I want you to be smart for once in your miserable life." His patience was already fraying, the mask slipping faster than it used to. "Do you think I wanted any of this?" Mother was asking too many questions. Father was building a case against me, and you— He jabbed a finger at her swollen belly. "You were supposed to be the obedient little sister who never noticed anything. Instead, you turned into a problem I keep having to solve." She was trapped, and Caspian was going to kill her. Or worse, drag her back to a life where his control was absolute. Unless she stopped running. The thought came again, louder this time, accompanied by a surge of something hot and fierce that she barely recognized as her own courage. She had spent 22 years cowering before this man, 22 years accepting his cruelty as her lot in life, his abuse as something she deserved. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She was the fated mate of the Alpha King, the mother of the child growing strong beneath her heart, and she was done letting fear dictate her choices. "I know about Father's journal," she said. Caspian froze. For the first time since she could remember, genuine emotion flickered across his face. Surprise, followed quickly by fury. "What did you say?" "The journal he kept in the hidden compartment of his study desk, the one where he documented his suspicions about Mother's death." Iris's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fed by the way Caspian's composure was beginning to crack. "He knew, Caspian. He knew you poisoned her tea. He was gathering evidence to expose you to the Alpha Council before you killed him too." "That journal doesn't exist." But his voice had lost its silky confidence. "I searched everywhere. I tore that house apart." "You searched the desk? You searched his office?" Iris smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. But I found it first, the day after they buried him, while you were busy accepting condolences. I hid it somewhere you would never think to look, somewhere only Mother and I ever went. She watched his face carefully, saw the way his eyes widened with sudden, terrible understanding. Your worthless, pathetic sister who you never considered a threat. I've had it all along. It was a bluff. She had the journal's location, not the journal itself. She was hundreds of miles from the Shadowfang pack house, and 3 years of weather might have destroyed the pages. But the bluff worked exactly as she had hoped. Caspian's mask shattered completely, replaced by the snarling, vicious creature she had always known lurked beneath his polished exterior. You little bitch! He spat, lunging toward her with claws extended. I'll tear it out of you. I'll gut you and that bastard whelp and burn whatever evidence you think you have. Iris didn't run, didn't cower, didn't close her eyes and wait for death the way she had 100 times in her nightmares. Instead, she opened her mouth and released the emergency howl Sebastian had drilled into her on the terrace, the frequency pitched to cut through stone and distance, the one he had prayed she would never need. The sound tore from her throat with more power than she had known she possessed, resonating through the mate bond like a bell being struck, carrying with it all her fear and defiance and desperate love. Caspian snarled and closed the distance between them, his claws slashing toward her belly. Iris didn't think. She acted. The tingling that had lived in her palms for days erupted. Not claws, though she felt those too, bursting from her fingertips with a pain that was almost sweet. But beneath them, energy, pure and burning, the bond force Sebastian had read about in the old texts, the power he had said only the strongest mates could manifest. It slammed into Caspian's chest and sent him staggering backward, 3 deep gouges scoring his face where her newly manifested claws had caught him. He screamed, actually screamed, a sound of pure shock and agony that she had never heard from him before. Blood poured down his face, and when he looked at her again, there was fear in his eyes. Real fear, the kind she had never seen him show. "What are you?" he gasped. Iris stood taller, her hand pressed protectively over her womb, her wolf howling in triumph inside her chest. The energy still hummed beneath her skin, warm and ready, and she understood now what Sebastian had meant about the old texts. The bond wasn't just a connection, it was a weapon, and it would answer any threat to the life she carried. "I'm the fated mate of the Alpha King," she said, "and I'm done being afraid of you." Caspian's eyes darted to the door, calculating, and for the first time Iris saw something she had never seen from her brother. The realization that he had miscalculated. That the girl he had bullied and manipulated for 22 years no longer existed, and the woman who had replaced her was something he didn't know how to fight. He lunged for her again anyway, because Caspian had never known when to stop. This time, Iris didn't even flinch. The energy flared from her palms, catching him mid-stride and hurling him backward into the bedpost with a crack that split the wood. The door exploded inward. Sebastian stood in the wreckage, his eyes blazing gold, his massive form filling the doorway as a snarl ripped from his throat that shook the stones of the walls. Behind him, guards poured into the corridor, weapons drawn, but Sebastian was already moving, crossing the room in 3 enormous strides to put himself between Iris and her bleeding, staggering brother. "I heard you," he growled, not taking his eyes off Caspian. "I felt you through the bond. Are you hurt?" "No." Iris moved to stand beside him, not behind him. He tried, but... She looked at her hands, at the fading glow of power that still lingered around her fingers. "I stopped him." Sebastian's expression shifted, pride and fierce love flickering through the rage. "Yes, you did." Caspian was backing toward the window, his hand pressed to his ruined face, his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. This is a misunderstanding, Your Majesty. She attacked me. I came here to warn you about her plans, and she's lying. She's always been worthless, just like our pathetic mother. The words fell into sudden silence. Sebastian went very still, and when he spoke, his voice was colder than Iris had ever heard it. My mate's worth is beyond measure, he said. Yours ends now. You can't kill me. Caspian's voice rose with panic. Diplomatic immunity, the treaties. You attempted to murder my mate and unborn child. You confessed to matricide and fratricide in front of witnesses. Sebastian gestured to the guards who had crowded into the doorway, their faces grim with disgust. You have no immunity here, only judgment. He moved toward Caspian with the deliberate grace of a predator, but Iris's voice stopped him. Wait. Sebastian turned, one eyebrow raised in question. Iris stepped forward, her hand finding his. He wronged me. My mother, my father, my entire pack, all destroyed by his schemes. I claim the right to pronounce judgment as the wronged party. A murmur ran through the assembled guards. Sebastian's eyes searched her face, looking for hesitation, for fear. He found only steel. Granted, he said, the judgment is yours. Iris turned to face her brother, the monster who had shaped her entire life with his cruelty, who had killed her parents, destroyed her reputation, driven her from the only home she had ever known. He was smaller than she remembered. Pathetic almost, cowering against the window with blood streaming down his face. Caspian Shadowfang, she said, her voice ringing clear and strong. For the murder of our parents, for treason against the crown, for the attempted murder of my unborn child, I sentence you to death. May the moon goddess show you more mercy than you ever showed anyone else. Iris, please. For one instant, his voice cracked into the frightened boy register she remembered from their childhood, when thunderstorms would send him crawling into her bed. The boy who had been afraid of the dark before he became the thing that lived in it. She felt nothing. Carry out the sentence, she said to Sebastian. Sebastian moved with the terrifying economy of a wolf who had fought for 2 centuries. His hand closed around Caspian's throat, lifting him clear off the ground. Caspian clawed at the iron grip, his feet kicking uselessly, his mouth working around words that would never come. Sebastian held him there for one long heartbeat. Long enough for Caspian to see the absolute absence of mercy in his golden eyes, and then, with one savage twist, tore out the traitor's throat. Blood sprayed across the window. Caspian's body crumpled to the floor, and Iris stood motionless, watching the life drain from the man who had terrorized her since childhood, feeling nothing but an overwhelming, exhausted relief. It was over. Finally, truly over. Sebastian was at her side in an instant, his hands gentle on her shoulders, turning her face away from the carnage. Iris, look at me. She did. His eyes were still gold, but the rage was fading, replaced by concern and a tenderness that made her throat tight. It's done, he said softly. He can never hurt you again. The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming, and Iris collapsed against his chest while the guards quietly removed her brother's body and the servants began the grim work of cleaning the blood from the floor. She cried for her parents, for the childhood stolen from her, for the years of fear and pain that had shaped her into someone who flinched from shadows. And when the tears finally stopped, she found that she felt lighter, freer. Like a weight she hadn't even known she was carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. That night, after the chaos had settled and the palace had quieted, Sebastian led her to their chambers with a gravity that made her pulse quicken. The moon hung full and heavy outside the window, bathing the room in silver light, and when Sebastian turned to face her, his eyes held a question that needed no words. The marking, Iris whispered. You want to complete the bond. I want it more than I have ever wanted anything. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly gentle. But only if you want it too. Only if you're ready. She was ready. She had been ready since the moment he had knelt in the throne room and declared her worth to the entire court. Since the night he had hunted smoked trout with his own hands because she had mumbled a craving in her sleep. She had been ready, perhaps, since the instant she had opened her eyes in his arms and felt her wolf cry mate with a certainty that went bone deep. "Mark me," she said. "Make me yours." His sharp inhale was audible in the quiet room. His eyes flared gold, and when he pulled her close, she could feel the tremor running through his massive frame, not from fear or hesitation, but from the force of his restraint as he fought to be gentle with her. He guided her to the bed, settling her among the pillows with the care he might have shown something infinitely precious. His fingers traced the junction of her neck and shoulder, the place where his mark would rest, the spot that had tingled with anticipation since the moment they met. "This will hurt," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "Only for a moment," and then he pressed a kiss to the hollow of her throat. "Then you'll feel what I feel. You'll know, truly know, that you are everything to me." Iris tilted her head back, baring her throat in surrender. "I trust you." The words seemed to break something in him. His lips parted against her neck, his tongue tracing the sensitive skin, and then his fangs descended, sharp and gleaming in the moonlight. The bite was white-hot, a blaze of pain that shot through her entire body like lightning. Iris gasped, her hands flying to grip his shoulders, her nails digging into his flesh as she fought to stay conscious through the overwhelming sensation. And then the pain transformed. Pleasure flooded through her, rich and golden and impossibly deep. She felt Sebastian's emotions pour into her through the bond, his fierce protectiveness, his aching tenderness, his bone-deep certainty that she was his and he was hers, and nothing in this world or any other would ever change that truth. Love, vast and overwhelming, washing through her like a tide. "Mine," he growled against her skin, his fangs still buried deep. "Mine." But it wasn't enough. The bond surged inside her, demanding completion, demanding equality. Iris pulled his face up from her neck, meeting his gold-blazed eyes with a ferocity that made his breath catch. "Mine too," she said, and sank her teeth into his shoulder. His roar shook the walls. His blood flooded her mouth, rich and wild, tasting of pine forests and moonlight and home. She felt his shock through the bond. Mates didn't usually mark their alphas. The claiming was supposed to be one-sided, and then his shock transformed into a joy so vast it brought tears to her eyes. The bond snapped into place with a force that shook them both, complete and unbreakable, and roaring with shared light. They fell back against the pillows together, tangled in each other's arms, breathing hard. Iris could feel him now, truly feel him, every emotion and thought bleeding through the golden thread that connected their souls. His love for her was a constant warmth, steady as a heartbeat. His fear that he might not deserve her, his determination to spend the rest of his life trying anyway. "Yours," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "Mate," he breathed back. They held each other as the moon traced its path across the sky, as the bond settled into their bones like an anchor. Iris felt whole for the first time in her life, not because Sebastian completed her, but because loving him had taught her that she had always been complete. She had simply needed someone to believe it before she could believe it herself. In the days that followed Caspian's death, Iris did not rest. There would be time for grief later, or not. What mattered now was the truth. "The Eastern Garden," she told Sebastian the morning after, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at every limb. "There's an old oak, the biggest one, with a hollowed stone between its roots. My mother and I used to read there. I wrapped the journal in oilcloth and hid it inside before Caspian could find it. She met his eyes. Send your fastest scouts. If the pages survived 3 years of weather, they'll prove everything. Sebastian dispatched a team within the hour. The journal arrived 4 days later, carried by a scout who looked as though she hadn't slept since crossing the Shadowfang border. The oilcloth had held. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but her father's careful handwriting was still legible. Dates, names, transactions, the slow accumulation of evidence against a son he had loved and feared in equal measure. Sebastian read it aloud in the council chamber, his voice flat and measured, and Iris watched the faces of his advisors shift from skepticism to horror. The blood moon payments, the poisoned herbs, the manufactured hunting accident. Every crime Caspian had confessed to in his final moments was documented in their father's own hand, corroborated by dates and witnesses who could now be questioned. Word spread fast. Within a fortnight, the first delegations arrived from the Shadowfang territory, wolves who had believed Caspian's lies, who had stood silent while Iris was branded and cast out, and who now came with bowed heads and shaking voices to beg the Alpha King's mercy and their former packmates' forgiveness. Iris granted both. Not because the wound had healed, it hadn't, and might never fully, but because she understood what it meant to be manipulated by someone you trusted. She had lived it. She would not perpetuate it. The Shadowfang pack, what remained of it, pledged itself to Sebastian's rule. The absorption was formal, bloodless, and final. Spring came early that year. Iris stood on the balcony of the throne room, watching the crowds gather in the courtyard below. She wore a crown of silver and moonstone, a gift from Sebastian's jewelers, and the deep blue gown that marked her as Luna Queen. The coronation ceremony the week before still felt like a dream, the weight of the crown settling onto her brow, Sebastian's hand warm in hers, the roar of thousands of wolves acknowledging the mate bond that had saved her life and reshaped the kingdom. But today was simpler, more personal. Today was the day she would present their daughter to the kingdom. Sebastian appeared at her side, their child cradled in his massive arms. Little Rowan, named for the tree that had sheltered Iris on her first night in Shadowmere territory, had her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and a set of lungs that could rival any alpha's battle cry. "Ready?" Sebastian asked. Iris looked out at the sea of faces, wolves from a dozen different packs, come to witness the birth of the future heir. She saw familiar faces among them, former Shadowfang wolves who had once looked away while she was branded, now standing shoulder to shoulder with Duskwalker soldiers, rebuilding the trust they had let Caspian destroy. She was no longer cast out, no longer worthless, no longer the pathetic girl whose cravings weren't worth hunting. "Ready," she said. They stepped forward together, Alpha King and Luna Queen, and the cheers that rose from below echoed off the mountains and shook the ancient stones of the palace. That night, after the celebrations had ended and Rowan had been settled in her cradle, Iris found Sebastian in the kitchens. He was elbow-deep in flour, his crown abandoned on the counter, cursing softly at a bowl of dough that refused to cooperate. "What are you doing?" she asked, fighting a smile. "You said you were craving honeyed bread." He gestured helplessly at the disaster around him. "I'm hunting your cravings." "Sebastian." She crossed the kitchen to wrap her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek to his flour-dusted back. "We have servants. You could just ask them." "Could." He turned in her arms, cupping her face with hands that were ridiculous and wonderful and covered in dough. "Won't. My mate will never want for anything, remember?" Iris looked up at this impossible man, this Alpha King who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to kneel, who had declared her worth to a hostile court, and then spent every day since proving it with actions rather than words. She had thought once that she understood what love meant. Dorian had taught her that love was conditional, fragile. easily withdrawn. Sebastian had shown her something different, something fierce and steady and unshakable, a bond that went beyond words or promises, or even the mystical connection between fated mates. "I love you," she said. His smile could have lit the darkest corner of the realm. "I know," he said. "I feel it every moment through the bond, and I will spend the rest of my days being worthy of it." He kissed her then, tasting of flower and joy and forever, and Iris kissed him back with all the love in her overflowing heart. Outside the kitchen window, the moon shone silver over Shadowmere territory, a kingdom at peace, a Luna who had found her home, and a love that would endure for all the ages to come.